In this lecture, we'll go over a checklist that I've created for you to think about in what needs to be done and considered when creating assessments for business English courses. So here's the checklist. The questions in the checklist will help you figure out the things that you would have to keep in mind when you select or create assessment tools for your business English course. All right, let's go through the questions one by one, and we'll look at each question more closely. First, you'll use commercially available tests, or will you create your own tests? Second, how many times will you assess your students? Third, what will you assess, and what are the goals? Fourth, how will you assess your students? What methods will you use to assess them? Fifth, where will you assess them? Sixth, how will you give feedback to them? These are the 6 questions that you would have to think about when assessing your students' progress and performance in business English. So let's start from the first question. Will you use commercially available tests, or will you create your own tests? Well, it would be great if you can create your own assessment tools that are fully customized for your students. But sometimes the circumstances really just don't allow this. For example, your class size might be too large, or you're teaching more than 4 to 5 sections of a course. In that case, assessing and giving feedback to all of your students can be very challenging. Or your students might have to submit a test score to their companies in order to show their progress. So let me briefly talk about the kinds of commercially available tests that are out there. I'm not going to go into detail about each test, since you can easily find information about them online. I'm here to introduce you to a few that you would find useful. Okay, the first one that I would like to talk about is the TOEIC, or the Test of English for International Communication. The TOEIC is widely used to test a test taker's proficiency in business English, but it only tests listening and reading. Recently, ETS, who makes the test, has added tests called TOEIC Speaking and Writing as well. The second one is BEC, or Business English Certificate, which is developed by Cambridge English. BEC tests your English in business settings, and there are 3 different levels. There are B1 for Business Preliminary, B2 for Business Vantage, and C1 for Business Higher. The next one is CEFIC, or Spoken English for Industry and Commerce. This one was developed by Pearson, and there are 5 different levels. Preliminary, and then levels 1 to 4. The last one I want to introduce to you is the Euro Pro exams for professional and business purposes. There are 3 levels, B1, B2, and C1, available for those exams. All right, so far we've talked about commercially available tests for business English that we can use to test your students' progress and their performance. If you decide to create your own tests, it's time for you to answer the next question. The second question is, how many times will you assess your students? If you want to look at your students' progress more closely and modify your assessment tools according to how much progress your students make, then you can assess your students multiple times in a course. For example, you can use an entry exam to assess where your students are at, and then build your own assessment tools to test your students once every 2 weeks or once a month. Or if your course runs as short as 4 weeks, you can have an assessment every week. Another option is to test your students once at midterm and once more at the end of the semester. You get to decide depending on your circumstances and, of course, your students' levels. Okay, what is the next question? It is, what will you assess? And what are the goals? This is the most important question in the checklist. First, let's take a look at what will you assess. Do you remember the 2 types of competence that we should focus on when teaching business English? They are communicative competence and intercultural competence. As we talked about in the previous lectures, assessing communicative competence includes thinking about what language skills you want to assess. You would need to think about how you want to assess the language skills together in one test, particularly for an English course for business purposes. This is because your students are required to use all 4 language skills in business-related settings. For example, let's say your students are attending a business meeting. They would need to read and understand business documents before the meeting, prepare meeting materials, talk about certain topics on the meeting agenda, and listen to colleagues and understand what they say in the meeting. This requires reading, listening, writing, and speaking skills. So it's important for you to test all language skills rather than testing one language skill at a time. In other words, you want to create assessments that integrate all the 4 language skills together. Okay, then what about intercultural competence? As a lot of researchers say, assessing intercultural competence is not an easy task. Byram suggests 4 aspects to consider when creating activities and assessments to evaluate intercultural competence. They are knowledge, attitudes, skills of interpreting and relating, and skills of discovery and interaction.